G'day guys, it's the Aussie engineer here, and today I'm going to take you through some of the principles that I use when I'm designing home networks for myself and friends. Um, the reason for this video is it will link into a bunch of other videos that I'll be looking at doing at the moment, and in fact there's one that will be coming out very shortly on some of the different elements that I put in to secure my network. For example, there's the next video coming out will be one looking at how to set VLANs up on edge routers in particular, and why you would even bother setting them up. So let's get straight into it, and let's get straight into having a look at the dilemma that I had been looking at solving and how I've actually got solving it, because I think there are some potential bits that you could use when you're designing your own home networks. One of the first bits I'll start with is I have a Edge router. I actually have the Edge 12, Edge Pro 12, and I've got that pretty much because I managed to pick it up through, I guess, an auction site, so selling off ex-government equipment. Got it for a really good price, and it is still, as much as it's old, it is still a very capable router. Although it is one that I'll be replacing reasonably soon, but it has served me well for at least the last 14 months. So let's just have a look, and I'm going to start putting down some basic bits and talking through the dilemma that you may have when you're setting up a home network, especially one if you've got a bunch of smart devices on it. So the first bit we're going to look at is obviously over here you have the internet coming into your system, and your WAN networks. So these will come straight in, and then we'll go into your router where your firewall sits. The next things, and I'm going to split up the devices I have in by the amount that I actually trust them inside the network, just to make it clear as to why I'm doing some of the things I'm doing. So if we're talking about our PCs, and for me, the Xbox, these devices over here, firstly, are hardwired, trusted devices that I have control over. And to me, when we're talking about most of the network stuff, these are things that are, to me, much lower risk on my network, although they are clearly at risk of other things. The next bunch of bits that I'll look at is my phone and things that connect wirelessly. So this is my trusted devices on Wi-Fi. Now, I put the barely readable yellow around the top of these ones, pretty much because one of the things you need to consider when you're putting together networks is that your networks and Wi-Fi networks are potentially vulnerable. So there's a lot of ways to decrease the risk that's posed by your Wi-Fi networks. For me at the moment, I live in an apartment complex. So as a result of that, and as a result of living inside the apartment complex that I'm in, there is a high degree of risk, because it's really easy for people, where I am, to be able to compromise it, because obviously they're right next to me through a wall and through a ceiling, and that raises the degree of risk. So if you're in a big house that's back from the road, and your Wi-Fi router barely reaches the road, then someone has to potentially enter your property before they're able to access your Wi-Fi network. So it's a much lower risk. But for me, if you like me, live in apartments, it's a higher risk. Anyway, the next series of devices that I'm going to look at are my guest networks. So these devices, as much as you'd really hope that if you've got a guest coming over to your place and you're going to let them access your networks, you'd really hope that they're trustworthy-ish, but that's obviously not always the case. So what I'll say is these are the ones that are mostly trustworthy, not completely, but enough that you're enough to trust to let on the network, but they could also be compromised. They're not devices you control yourselves, so they're things that pose more of a risk than potentially your own equipment. Then lastly, we have the IoT things and smart home stuff. Now, a lot of the stuff, depending on where you get your equipment, this stuff has varying degrees of trust associated with, and a lot of the times, not much. And notoriously, these sort of things are notoriously bad for their security. And clearly, these are not things that you want on the same network as other devices down the other end of the spectrum. So if you're talking about, your Xbox and stuff, you really don't want your PC on a network where you may have devices which are a high risk, because they then become a vector inside your network. So the question is, how do you do this? And how do you look at then designing this sort of network? Just let me just add that these last bits, and especially in the instance that I have, most of these are Wi-Fi, but not all. So I have some on the LAN as well. A bit of a combination of both of those. So now when we start looking at our networks, to me, one of the first things I do is my trusted hardwired devices. I have them on their own completely separate VLAN. As standard, you can put them on this, your 1-24. So these things I would put on a standard LAN, on the VLAN. They're not, but this isn't on a VLAN. This is on a standard LAN, and it is also, and I'll talk about in another video about how I set up, how you can set up stuff inside edge routers. This will also be the only network, either actual LAN or VLAN, that will talk directly to the router. And once again, this is just down to security through access. So if someone is attempting to compromise from your network, having access into your house is a lot. There's a lot more steps they've got to go through, so you have protection in that method, as opposed to some of the Wi-Fi networks or Wi-Fi dash devices. So the next thing I'll draw in here is how I address this issue of the other ones. So in my place, I use a Ubiquiti hardware for my wireless networks, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Apart from the fact that I like them, I like the interfaces, I like the way they're set up, and they're pretty easy to do the next bits that I'm going to talk about at the moment. So I will have with those a number of different access points, which will all be connected back, through generally a PoE switch in the middle of them to power them. So and part of the reasons I do this is, firstly, by doing this, it allows redundancy, it allows coverage. Admittedly, I live in an apartment, so I kind of, dominate the RF frequencies around, the Wi-Fi frequencies around my apartment. But that also is part of it, because if you're living in a more confined or higher density population area, you'll find that the Wi-Fi bands are very congested, and without appropriate gear, you'll find yourself being knocked out potentially by your neighbours. And indeed, in the last place I lived at before I went this route by using Ubiquiti access points, that was exactly what was happening. So, in short, the standard router Wi-Fis weren't strong enough. And as a result, I would find myself being knocked off my own network and losing connection in different parts of the apartment. All right, so now when we look at how we connect this up, this will then come into one of the different other LAN ports. But at this PoE switch, things get broken down. So as I said, some of my IoT devices will be connected directly to the switches and will be connected via wires. whereas the rest of them will be connected over Wi-Fi. Now here is where VLANs come into it. So what I generally will do with this one is number each one of these a separate VLAN, generally with tags, .20, VLAN tags 30, and then 40. What that then allows me to do, and I'll talk about it more in the VLAN video, but in short, where these packets receive their tags for the specific VLANs, part of that will occur at the wireless access points, depending on the SSID they're connected to. So, for example, my phones, my wirelessly connected devices, connected via Wi-Fi, will be on one SSID. My guest will have its own SSID, and in fact, they get a QR code so they can log directly onto it. And same, my Internet of Things will have its own SSID, and at the different access points, as the packets come in, they'll be flagged them with those VLAN tags, and then obviously go back through the router where the DHCP server for each of those different VLANs is held. And on the actual PoE switch, and this is why in certain instances, especially if you're going to do this and up this sophistication of your network, you will need to have set ports assigned to different VLANs such that devices which are connected, so IoT, for example, the handful of PoE IoT devices that I have in the apartment, each one of those will receive the appropriate flags, VLAN flags, based upon the ports inside the PoE switch. So what this means then in practice is, like I said, I will have three Wi-Fi SSIDs, one for each of these, and just to go in a bit more when it comes to how VLANs work, what it means is this cable from the router to the PoE switch then here will then be carrying traffic for those three different virtual LANs, and the router then will be set up such that it segregates the traffic from those networks, virtual networks, and doesn't allow traffic between them. What that then means is, for example, each one of these is able, so each one of the different virtual LANs, and in fact the main primary LAN, will all be able to connect to the internet. The wide network is the one that does the management of the router in particular. It will also be able to talk to the PoE switch as well. So the PoE switch will be set up in such a way that it is able to talk through this to there. So all of the network management is done along this, and then it is this port and these connections and virtual LANs which then split out the different, less trusted networks that networks for the different devices that I have. One of the last bits that I will highlight with this, and you'll see in the video when it comes to how to set up VLANs, each one of these then will have, sorry, let me tidy that one up. And each one of these will obviously have their own router addresses, and it'll be like this. So this is the first network, the second network, the third, and then the fourth network, like so. And this is how the IP addresses are segregated. So once again, if I'm looking at how things have been assigned, it provides a check for me as to making sure that each of the different networks is actually segregated from each other, and we're not going to have problems. All right, guys. So this is a bit of an overview of how I design my network. Like I said, I use Ubiquiti access points in the middle of this over here. One of the issues with this though is that they are a much more expensive solution, and I'm going to show you a solution that one of my friends uses to achieve something similar but not quite the same. So let's just create a new board. Let's give ourselves a new board. All right, so he's identified a very similar problem, except he hasn't quite split it down to the same bits. So in the same bit, we have our trusted wired devices. He then has, your phones and stuff, which are semi-trusted. You then have the guest and IoT. Now, as I said, one way to do it is pretty much the way I showed you before, which is using a single, more capable central router. But here's how he does it. So his internet box, which comes in, has multiple ports on it. Each one of these ports, puts out 4 ports with its own DHCP inside the initial modem. And whether you're able to do this will be dependent on the type of device that's coming in to your place. Some can do this, some can't do this. What he's then done is bought 2 cheap Wi-Fi routers, like so. And then runs wires where appropriate, and then uses the Wi-Fi off here, and then has, trusted SSID and a guest -IoT SSID over here. Now, given you can pick up routers pretty cheaply with wireless access points on them, this is not a bad approach. Let's put this on here to designate the wireless traffic. It's not a bad approach. The only bit and the only reason why I'm a little bit more hesitant about this is over here. So when you look at this network here, this connection here means that if that wireless SSID, your trusted wireless SSID, is compromised, so that network's compromised, then there is the potential for connected devices along this chain to be compromised. Now, once again, if we go backwards and we have a look at this network, as I said, the advantage of this is if any one of these is compromised, it doesn't do anything to our trusted devices. Like, don't get me wrong, you still have an issue with the things that are connected along here, but with none of these networks having the ability to talk to the router and with or any of your other connected devices over down on the right left-hand arm, it provides a much higher degree of security in my eyes anyway. Alright guys, just to show you quickly before I end this video why I use the Ubiquiti access points and why I talk about the higher risk when you're looking inside an apartment building. I'm just going to show you the environmental scan of where I am at the moment. So one of the beauties of the Ubiquiti system, once again, is it can pull out a lot of different information and pull out a lot of different data. So if we come across at the moment, what you'll see is the current scan of the environment that I'm in. There are a total of 53 different wireless networks which are within range of my apartment at the moment, ranging in strength. Obviously, part of that's going to be down to their specific locations, and noting that some of those also have multiple accesses and as you can see in some of these instances, there's different bits talking on different channels as it is. Now, what this means, number one, is, as I said, firstly, when I was talking about the risk of, I guess, compromise, potentially any one of these networks, if there was someone who was an uncool actor, let's say, someone who decided they wanted to play around, the fact that I'm in range of them and able to detect their networks means it's highly likely that they'd be able to detect my network, and then it's literally a case of time and the right tools potentially to be able to break into the Wi-Fi networks. Additionally, you can see, especially when we're talking about 2.5, the 2.5 bands here are absolutely jam-packed. And this pretty much means that without high quality equipment which is able to move channels rapidly, which also has the appropriate antennas to pick up and send and all the rest of it, there is a good chance that I would be at risk of losing Wi-Fi connection even inside a relatively small apartment. Hence, once again, why I use the equipment that I do. So, guys, this is just a bit of an insight into, for me, wireless network setups, why I set up, and some recommendations to have a think about. What I think is absolutely worth doing too is, when you want to do this, have a look at the devices that you've got. In some instances, you may not need to do, or may not see the need to do, any of these things. Hell, you may not have people come over that much, or may not want to give people access to internet when they come over to your place, which rules out the need for a guest network. So ultimately, draw out what your devices are, break them down into groups, and then determine whether the risk is high enough for you, or your network's complex enough that you need to then do a little bit of planning, put it all together, and then have a look at what's inside your budget for the specific devices. Anyway, guys, I really hope this was informative. It's planned to be the start of a handful of other videos which will go into more specifically how to set up some of the devices, some of the pitfalls with setting these up, some of the bits that will catch you and cause you to spend hours doing something which seems very simple on the surface, and that's particularly relevant when you start talking about VLANs, because they can be incredibly painful. But anyway, guys, I hope this was useful. I hope it prompted your brains to think a bit about this sort of stuff. But as always, have yourself a great day and stay safe.